from their co-creation process, and then we'll run through a list of resources and other support the OGP support unit can offer. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions as we go. Please either insert them into the chat box or raise your hand. So let's get started. So all OGP participants commit to developing their action plans through a multi-stakeholder process with the active engagement of citizens and civil society. We aim to connect reformers inside and outside government to come up with ambitious solutions that can be implemented in response to national priorities and citizen needs. Drawing on community experience and expertise helps ensure that understandings of the problems and solutions draw upon all available knowledge, and that stakeholders impacted will accept and have buy-in in any intervention. In the first few cycles of co-creation for many countries, there's been a tendency to approach co-creation as a series of consultations, but without necessarily an intentional process agreed up front on what the for. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, we'll go. Sorry, I've just been asked to slow down a little bit. Yes, and how... So in the first few cycles, we saw that there was a approach to co-creation as a series of consultations, but without necessarily an intentional process agreed up front about how, what will form priorities, who will be targeted for outreach, and how inputs will be considered, how decisions will be made, who will make them, and how these will be communicated with those engaging in the consultative process. As most countries now move towards developing successive national action plans that build on prior experience, there's now a need to be much more intentional about how we design these processes. And OGP's latest research shows that countries with stronger co-creation processes tend to deliver much more ambitious action plans. So let's run through the requirements and the standards. So the requirements are the minimum steps countries need to follow to remain compliant with the rules of OGP membership. And these are explained, as you may be aware, in the OGP handbook. There are 4 procedural requirements that countries must meet to be part of the partnership. And these are measured by a minimum threshold, which leads to consequences if they're not met. Additionally, OGP has developed the co-creation and participation standards. These are 60 basic and advanced standards, which set goals countries should strive to meet, break down the co-creation elements and levels of participation. And these are available as a separate document available online. So let's start with the requirements. To remain in compliance with the rules of membership, OGP countries must meet 4 basic requirements. First, they must publish an action plan within 4 months of the date the action plan is due to be published. So the 31st of August is the deadline, and a 4-month grace period ends on December 31, so at the end of the calendar year. Second, they must meet the involve requirement during development of the National Action Plan, and the inform requirement during implementation of the action plan. This is assessed according to IRM guidance, and we'll get into the meat of this in a moment. Third, they must document, collect, and publish a repository, again, according to IRM guidance. And lastly, they must make progress in commitment implementation throughout the course of the National Action Plan. And again, if any of these are not met, then if a country doesn't meet these twice in 2 successive action plan cycles, they're placed under review, and if further remediation or progress isn't made, then they can be made inactive from the partnership. So let's start with involve, an explanation of what that means. So you may have heard of the International Association for Public Participation, and we use their scales for public participation in measuring the standards for which communities can be engaged and influence the co-creation process and the implementation process of a national action plan. These are expressed in terms of a spectrum from inform on one side to empower at the most meaningful end, with each successive stage growing more meaningful and substantial. So we're requiring that countries meet the involve standard during the co-creation process, and And there are a series of factors that weigh into that consideration. Let's talk about two of them: the presence of a multi-stakeholder forum and the reasoned response mechanism. So firstly, the presence of a multi-stakeholder forum, and I'm sure most of you, let's go to the next slide, are aware of multi-stakeholder forums. The standard that we use is that a forum exists and that the forum is multi-stakeholder. That is, it includes both government and civil society representatives. So some countries might take a formal route of establishing the forum, its mandate and procedures through official directives or regulation. Others might do this more informally for each action plan cycle. In some cases, the IRM will need to assess whether actions taken in a country constitute an equivalent to a multi-stakeholder forum, even if it doesn't typically look like one. So the IRM will look at things like the regularity of meetings, whether the way of working is collaborative, whether the mandate of the forum is public, whether it's co-constituted by government and civil society members, whether the process of selecting members is transparent, and the ways of working, whether it allows for remote participation, whether the minutes of the proceedings are made available. So that's the first. One of the things that folks will the IRM will look for in assessing whether a country meets the standard of involve. The second is around whether a reasoned response process exists. So at the basic level, this means that the government publishes an overview of public and civil society contributions to the co-creation process and the government's response on the national OGP website and webpage. It also requires that once commitments have been drafted, government representatives review with the multi-stakeholder forum their comments, the final selection of commitments to be included in the action plan, and state clearly their reasoning behind decisions. So that's it at a basic level. At a more advanced level, you can see that there are a few differences that strengthen the process. Firstly, that we require all written contributions to be published rather than just an overview. And secondly, that the reasoning behind their inclusion or exclusion in the final plan is also published, and that includes a justification for commitment proposals that are not adopted. The other set of standards I want to touch upon before we finish up here are the participation and co-creation standards. Again, these are 60 standards that apply throughout the cycle. At a basic level, we're asking, and they're split into basic and advanced standards. So the basic standards are those at which we ask all OGP countries to meet. This is an overview on this slide. As you can see, it includes a repository to exist, multi-stakeholder forum to exist, which we've talked about, proactive communication to occur during the co-creation process, the consultation occur, that multi-stakeholder forum meetings occur frequently, and that during implementation, there's opportunity for people to comment on and query the progress, that open meetings with civil society occur at least once a year, and that multi-stakeholder forum meetings occur at least once per quarter. At the advanced level, again, we're looking at a similar set of considerations, but at a stronger and more meaningful level. So more proactive outreach during the entire cycle, a multi-stakeholder forum that is jointly chaired and makes decisions together, again, with a parity between civil society and government. During co-creation, we're asking the multi-stakeholder forum to be engaged in setting thematic priorities, to conduct consultations both online and across the country, and oversighting the operation of working groups that might take responsibility for further developing detail on specific commitments. We're asking that proposed commitments be assessed transparently using a process that's predetermined. During implementation, we're looking for things like whether consultation has occurred around the self-assessments that happen at the end of a cycle, whether multi-stakeholder forum meetings and other community members have the opportunity to meet with relevant ministers, and that working groups monitor implementation of specific commitments. So let me now turn to a representative from our IRM unit to talk about how the IRM assesses the co-creation process.
Hi everyone, my name is Tina Tin and I work for the Independent Reporting Mechanism team. We assess the action plans in two different moments. First, at the beginning, when the action plans are submitted, we look at the design and also the process for co-creation. And we also assess the implementation and early results of commitments once the action plans are completed. So co-creation process is one of the things we look at closely, and we use certain assessment criteria that is based on the participation and co-creation standards. As Ellen mentioned, there are 60 of them in total, but we look at very specific elements that are particularly important in deciding whether the co-creation process is open and participatory and collaborative. So one of the first things we look at is whether there is a multi-stakeholder forum that allows the possibility for multiple actors, civil society, different government representatives, and other members of non-organized civil society to participate in the process. We would look at whether there is actually a body or a group, sometimes it's called a working group or a council or a forum in some countries, that has established rules of operation and meets with some regularity. In some cases, there might not be an official body established, but there has to be a forum which meets with a certain regularity, which is multi-stakeholder. That's absolutely important, that that space where the meetings take place consists of different stakeholders, and that it has a mandate it has a collaboratively developed mandate in terms of governance, the membership, and the remit in terms of what the forum, what the body is actually supposed to do, and how it's meant to develop the action plan. So it's absolutely important that this forum includes members of both the government and non-governmental representatives. We also look at the thing whether parity, meaning there is more or less a balance of representation between government participants and non-governmental representatives in the forum. Another important element is whether there is a transparent selection process for non-governmental members and how that's being done. A lot of countries have very clear rules on how the call for the members is put out, how the selection takes place, how the approvals are done. So that's something that we look at carefully. Another thing that's important to take into consideration is whether the forum actually consists of high-level government representatives who have the decision-making power. This is important as committing to highly ambitious actions requires the relevant decision-making authority. And we can see that sometimes that can be missing, particularly in the countries in this region. The forum also needs to be open, meaning that it needs to accept inputs from non-governmental actors, whether civil society or other. And also, it has to provide space for stakeholders outside of the forum to contribute to the process. Sometimes the bodies that act as multi-stakeholder forums might have limited membership, for example, but it's important that other non-governmental actors also have the chance to attend the meeting, make their contributions, and get the feedback on the submissions. We also look at whether there is remote participation provided. This is particularly important in cases where the process needs to reach out to organizations or community-based groups that are not necessarily based in the capital, or in the cases when, for example, because of the geographic diversity, etc., it's important to reach out to the groups maybe in remote areas. So we look at whether there are online participation methods, other channels that help with the process. And as you know, last year we have seen quite a lot of countries actually introducing a lot of remote participation elements because of the pandemic. We also look at whether is done properly by the multi-stakeholder group, whether there is a proactive communication on the minutes and also report backs on what has been discussed and how the decisions have been made. In the development of the action plan, we also look at whether the process of developing the action plan is transparent. One of the important things for that is, of course, the existence of the OGP website and also what we call the OGP repository, where all the information about the meetings, agendas, minutes, major decisions made is posted and is publicly accessible. There also needs to be a documentation in advance and advance notices given to the members of the forum and also to the stakeholders who are involved in the development of the process, so that they have the time to prepare, to review documents, and to also prepare their inputs. Awareness raising is an important part of the co-creation process and something that often requires going beyond just usual suspects, conducting public awareness campaigns that can help to bring in the inputs from the larger society. Another important thing that Alan already mentioned in his presentation is a reasoned response, meaning that the multi-stakeholder forum needs to publish its reasoning behind decisions and also respond to different categories of feedback received during the co-creation process. And you can see that this is in bold here because extent the country meets the required standard on the IIP2 spectrum. So to meet the involved level, there needs to be a reasoned response provided to the feedback received during the co-creation process. So that's an important thing to remember, because if this standard is not met, then this can actually trigger the country review based on the country acting contrary to OGP process. Another important thing that can also trigger country acting review is the existence of a repository. As I said, there needs to be an online space where government provides information on the development of the action plan, posts minutes, provides feedback, and uploads all other information related to the IRM process. We also use traffic light colors when we do this assessment. So you can see that green means that the standard is met. Yellow means that some elements of the standard are being met, but not fully. There is still work to be done for improvements. And red means that the standard is not met. Next. And here I just wanted to give a snapshot of the regional performance from the 10 countries that we currently have actively participating in OGP. So as you can see, most countries meet the standards for involve and even do better. They meet the standards for collaboration, but there is one country that does not meet the standard. It's below the threshold of involve. It has only met the level of consult, and there are 2 countries that meet the standard, Papua New Guinea and New Zealand. Now, this data is based on the latest action plans. Some of these action plans are from 2017 to 2019, and there is one, Indonesia, that's from 2020. I also want to highlight some major gaps, cross-country gaps that we have observed across pretty much all countries assessed. The first one is very often the priorities of citizens or wider civil society don't seem to always influence the selection of final commitments, or at least it's not clearly explained in the action plans how the wider priorities influence the selection. The second one is representatives of government agencies involved in the co-creation process are not always equipped with the relevant decision-making power to commit to ambitious actions. While multi-stakeholder forums do include representatives of ministries or government agencies, they don't always carry enough power to actually commit to actual policy changes and government practices. Commitments also are not always designed in a way that allow the identification of specific policy issues to be addressed, and sometimes miss the link to the solution of the identified problem. And that's something that we notice very often when we assess commitments, because sometimes it's not easy to identify what is the specific policy issue targeted, what is the specific solution proposed in the commitment, and what is going to be the concrete intended result at the end of the implementation that we are going to come back and measure as a result of this commitment. So that requires more work on identifying specific policy issues, potential solutions, and then linking specific proposals in the commitments to that. Next. And also for some inspiration purposes, I wanted to share with you some good examples from the latest action plans that offer perhaps a glimpse of how some of these gaps could be addressed. One of these examples could be Spain, which actually submitted a 4-year action plan and conducted a very extensive cooperation process throughout. One of the features of this cooperation process was a very extensive consultation with local administrations and the cooperation process in several stages, while at each stage, an extensive feedback was provided to the stakeholders. And that feedback was very well documented in terms of minutes and always made available in the repository. There has been a very iterative process in terms of developing the documents, conducting cooperation workshops, preparation of the draft plan, and then in the end, approval of a 4-year action plan by the Open Government Forum, which is a multi-stakeholder forum of Spain. If you are interested in more details, we would be happy to provide that information, but you can get some glimpse of the key elements of that cooperation process from here. Another example would be Costa Rica from Latin America that had a particularly strong engagement strategy, and they did very well in terms of reaching out to the new actors, including new groups, and also diversifying the regional spread. They conducted extensive consultations in all 5 regions of the country and included regional representatives in their national workshops. They also reached out to different branches of the government and identified specific themes. They prioritized 9 target themes from the beginning of the cooperation process and made sure that they were talking to all the actors who were key stakeholders in those themes. And they conducted a widespread consultation with civil society that went just beyond the consultation, but really included very active engagement of a diverse civil society, including not only organized professional CSOs, but also private sector and academics, and particularly groups that are usually marginalized, such as, for example, people with disabilities, different women's groups, etc. So also the important part of this consultation process was done according to prioritized themes and making sure that they were talking to the potential beneficiaries of those themes that would be directly affected by the implementation of these commitments. Another example that I also wanted to share with you was from Canada, because it provides a good example of providing a very detailed reasoned response. As we spoke earlier, this is one of the important elements of the cooperation process and can trigger having a country acting contrary if there is not detailed enough feedback provided to the submissions received during the cooperation process. So the government of Canada provided a report called What We Heard Summary Report that provides very detailed description of what feedback was received during the cooperation process, how that was addressed, what was included in the action plan process, what was not included, and for those proposals that were not included, relevant justifications were provided. So this is actually a very good report. You can have a look at the document and see how you can provide a very good reasoned response to the submissions received during the cooperation process. And of course, the timing of the publication is also important to make sure that this is being done on time and in the process of the cooperation process, so that people have publicly available information and can follow the process and understand what's the reasoning behind the selection of commitments. I will stop here and see if there are any questions or comments on what we have covered so far.
Thank you. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for the presentations. Very interesting, very informative. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I've joined you from Kabul, Afghanistan. My name is Sohail Kokar. I'm the Director General for Coordination, Monitoring and Reporting in Ministry of Finance. I happen to be one of pioneers in establishment of OGP and acquiring the Open Government Partnership in Afghanistan, working closely with Yamayari. If you happen to know him, he was the person who presented the membership request in Paris, and I was closely working with him together with my colleague Najman. So on engagement, very briefly, is it part of the plan of action when countries develop their plans of action? Is it required to have it as part of plan of action for the engagement, for the strategic communication, or is it something separate? Because I've been following how Afghanistan is making progress towards its membership in the OGP, towards realization and implementation of principles. But at the same time, I think there is more work needs to be done in terms of strengthening the engagement, strengthening the partnership within the government organizations and also the civil society. I saw in the participants we have Ms. Haidari, who is in the OGP Secretariat, but still that was my question in terms of having like a strategic communication or strategic engagement as part of the plan of action. Is it required or not? Thank you. Over.
Thanks. It's great to see one of the original pioneers of the OGP Afghanistan process. And that's a really good question, right? And I think this is where, in a way, we need to separate the rules and the minimum requirements, which are intended to sort of, provide the institutional framework for engagement, and start shifting up to sort of thinking about what is the spirit behind all of the rules and what are the processes that are needed to actually realize that spirit in reality. So as far as the rules are concerned, as you would have seen, there is an expectation around awareness raising, there's an expectation around communication, and there's an expectation around engagement of multiple stakeholders. But what we're seeing, and I think you said this resonates with in Afghanistan as well, is the need for intentionality about all of that, right? So when countries do the action plans for the first time, or even the second, there's a tendency to think of engagement in terms of numbers. So how many localities that we go to, how many people attended the consultation events, the number of activities we conducted, but less so a focus on what is the purpose behind the engagement of all of those stakeholders? What do they actually need to be able to participate meaningfully in those spaces? We've learned, I think, as we've observed co-creation process, and we'll touch upon this a bit later in the presentation, where people are introduced to, what open government is, what OGP is, and then asked to workshop what the open contracting commitment details should look like, all within the same space. And we realized that that's not been particularly effective, even if the data looks good in terms of ticking off the box that you asked people, you had the consultation, you went to subnational locations. So we would definitely encourage countries to have a communication and engagement strategy, and also sort of bifurcate that, I would say, along your stakeholder groups, right? Because your communication strategy for your ordinary citizens, right? What does that need to look like? That probably needs to look very different in terms of socializing why open government matters in their day-to-day lives, and being able to understand from them their problems and how the officials might be able to respond to them with open government approaches. With line ministries, with technical staff, you probably need a completely different communication engagement strategy, which convinces them that this is a valuable exercise beyond their daily jobs, and how it can perhaps enhance what they're doing if they bring in citizens and others into those processes. So it's not, we don't rate the communication and engagement strategies as part of official compliance, but it's certainly a direction I think we would encourage all countries to take, particularly as you go from a one action plan cycle to the next, where the whole thing can start to seem a bit repetitive. And it's good to pause and think about, again, that intentionality of what are we trying to achieve with all our engagement methods, whether it's going to citizens, whether it's involving CSOs or different state institutions.
Thank you, Shreya, for the explanation. That's why I raised this issue. I think this could be one of the suggestions to put it part of compliance, because it's very important to have the stakeholders analysis, to have your stakeholders metrics, and to have a proper plan for your communication and engagement. Because I can tell you the lessons learned from Afghanistan. At the beginning, when you start an initiative, so you have a lot of meetings, you have a lot of consultations and engagements and conversation going on at the national and subnational level amongst the government bodies and the civil society. But once you reach in the middle of the journey, then things tend to lose momentum, and you don't know what to do, and etc. It goes on like a seesaw process. So you are good at times, and then you're not. But if you make it part of the compliance and make it compulsory for the countries to have particularly the countries like Afghanistan, to have a plan of communication which is long term and which is well detailed out. It's devised with coherence, how to engage the government, how to. I mean so I was with National Procurement Authority as a strategic communication director. What we did there, we developed strategic communication and knowledge dissemination on procurement reform, doing our stakeholders analysis. And first, we created the golden rectangle of government, civil society, and private sector. Then we expanded that to golden triangle. I'm sorry. Then we expanded to the golden rectangle, and we included media as well. And then with that, we said, well, let's establish the coalition for reform from this rectangle, and that was a requirement, and it was successful. So I think to make it part of the compliance process, it would really help to keep the momentum going on and keep the communication and engagement as a key part of the partnership process. Thank you.
Thanks, Sahil. Any other questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I hope to all of you be healthy and fine. I am Nazira Rahman, Deputy Minister for Women Economic Empowerment from Ministry of Women Affairs, Afghanistan. And I don't have any question, but I have a few remarks I would like to share with you. Thanks for presentation, for very well prepared. All remarks issue for improvement of OGP should writtenly shared. And mechanism of regular coordination at the government level specify. Non-government organization coordination mechanism also clarify. All stakeholders of OGP managed by mechanism. OGP plan before finalizing should share with all stakeholders for their comments. And also try to focus on women empowerment issue in OGP document. The OGP document should design on the base of each country situation and needs. And the end, I would like to propose an international workshop for finalization of OGP document. Done. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazira. And yes, it's good to see government coming in with such a strong endorsement of good process, and we will actually be talking about gender and inclusion a little bit later in the presentation. I see that Ken has his hand up, so Ken.
Thank you very much. First, to introduce myself, my name is Ken Kogel. I'm from Australia, and I'm a member of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum, which we call the Open Government Forum. Just in terms of my personal background, I'm now retired, but my first occupation was as a public servant, a public sector veterinary surgeon in the state government administration. And then I had a short time as a member of a local government council, and then 17 years in the Victorian State Parliament. And during that 17 years, I spent about 10 years as a member of the party which was in government. And in that period, 6.5 years as the Secretary of the Cabinet, which was a political position rather than a public service position. So that's a bit of my background. After I left retired from the Parliament, I was a academic at one of the major Melbourne universities, and I retired from that, and I've now got an honorary position at a different university. But my question or comment concerns a point that was made in one of the slides. It was called Table 7, and section or point 2D was about government decision makers being involved. And the comment I wanted to make really partly draws on my own career experience, as well as my experience in the forum, the multi-stakeholder forum. And that is that the people who are the decision makers in the end are the elected officials, the members of government, in Australian terms, the ministers. And in my observation of ministers, they are amongst the most busy, hard-working occupation of any. And I say that on the basis of having watched them firstly as Cabinet Secretary and then from occupying the chair as the Speaker of the Victorian State Parliament. Now, that means that these people have very little opportunity to spend time actually being directly involved in a multi-stakeholder forum or in the wider process for each member country. And that means that it's really a very difficult thing to expect them to be directly involved as decision makers at all stages of a country's preparation and implementation of its action plan. That's not to say that it's impossible for them to find time, but I just want to make the point that it is asking very busy people to make a time where it's going to have some benefit to them. And with that in mind, I think it's really important to structure the operations of the multi-stakeholder forum so that whatever time a elected official, a minister, spends with them is time that's going to be valuable to the minister as well as to the members of the forum. So that's the main point that I wanted to make. But I do emphasise it's not to say that they haven't got any time to be involved. It's more a matter of they have to be convinced that there is an advantage to them and to your country in them being directly involved in the decision making, rather than expecting themselves to be represented at the stakeholder forum by an appointed official, and to liaise with the elected official in giving the forum an exchange of views with the elected official, helping to make sure that the forum makes decisions which are fully cognizant of the views and concerns of the elected officials. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thanks, Ken. I think that's a good point, and this is why the level of decision making is not necessarily reflected in the, in the acting contrary or the procedural review or compliance triggers. With that in mind, that what that level is when different countries will vary, and therefore sort of making that a strict requirement for all 78 countries to follow becomes hard. And we get into this a bit further down as well, but I think here again, the intentionality of the process at the outset matters, especially where you have ministers as the ultimate decision makers. I think what we would want to avoid is an MSF running a process that goes and talks to lots of citizens, lots of civil society, brings back ideas, and the ministers haven't been engaged. And at the end of the process, basically what you get is ministers shutting down that plan if they haven't been. So it's not about necessarily having the ministers in the forum per se, but either having processes in place for the multi-stakeholder forum to brief at key moments advisors to the ministers who might keep them apprised, or engage them if there are certain things that seem like they might need interim decision making if they relate to ideas that might not have been provisioned for in the budget, as it currently stands, or those pieces. So this is not to say that we expect every MSF to have ministerial level representatives, but it is to say that there should be a pathway to decision making from that body that is being vested with the authority of running such an elaborate process, so that there isn't disappointment at the end of it, as we see in some cases. But point well taken, Ken.
Thanks. I can see that there are quite a few hands up. We might just take two and move on. We've built in 2 or 3 additional opportunities for questions later on in the workshop, so there will be more opportunity for people to have a chat. Of course, you can always also add your question into the chat, and we'll incorporate and use that when we next have a Q&A session. But I saw Oyuntia and Undral with their hands up, so let's take you two, one after the other, and then we'll need to move on. But Oyuntia? I need to unmute yourself. No, sorry, Oyuntia, we can't hear you. Maybe put your question in the chat and we'll get around to answering that. Undral?
Hello, hi. My name is Undral. I'm from Mongolia and work very closely, or trying to work very closely with our OGP to make it a bit better and improve it, but a little bit not getting the results. And I'm kind of disappointed to seeing my country in red in the performance, that it's on consultation level. But I know that this real situation is it. And lots of Mongolian civil society organizations who are working in the field of openness and transparency and accountability were all working on that, trying to push, trying to meet with them, to meet with the government, to make it, to work on it, etc. But when the government is not responsive, what to do? I know this is maybe not necessary to answer to this question, but it's kind of comment or kind of my thought.
It's a good question, Andrea. It's one of those which is obviously difficult and tricky. I mean, there are a couple of things that are sort of within the OGP toolbox on this. And some of these tools have become harder to sort of deploy, of course, in a pandemic where in-person sort of meetings and some of those things that we did through those face-to-face opportunities have become much harder. There are a couple of things on that front. One is, diplomatic outreach to the steering committee, which, as you know, with Mongolia as well, we're trying. The second is engaging development partners that tend to support a lot of open government-related initiatives, in certain countries, and seeing if they can carry those messages as well. And here again, the support unit is happy to work with civil society in these instances to identify and reach out to those partners. There is an element of sort of also understanding from civil society what are the priorities that are keeping the government government attention focused elsewhere, and seeing if there's a way in which we might be able to reframe the value that OGP can bring with within those those priorities that are preoccupying the government, and sort of organize peer exchanges, with those officials, whether it's at the core anchor ministry or whether it's at with the line ministries, with their peers, so that they can also hear from their counterparts and how they're dealing with it. And the last and final one, I think this is where we have the procedural review. Unfortunately, sometimes it does take that process of putting a country under procedural review, making a country inactive, and giving a year, for seeing improvements that ultimately gets the government to take it seriously, so that they're not seen as sort of being removed from the partnership because of inaction. So we, at the support unit, we always hope that that's not what it goes to. But sometimes that last blunt tool is the tool that is left, and we look forward to working with Mongolia in this cycle to hope that's not where we find ourselves. But if it does, then that's exactly what the procedural review is for.
I am mindful. Oh, thanks, Undral. I am mindful of time, and we do have a little bit more content to get through. For those whose hands are up, I see them. Either leave your questions for the next round of Q&A that we'll do soon, or enter them into the chat, and we'll get to you next. I might throw to Ivy, my colleague, now, just to talk about setting up the co-creation process.
Thanks, Alan. I'll be covering that bit.
Oh, sorry.
So, no worries. One of the things that, we've covered the standards and the requirements so far, and many of you, in the countries that you're coming from, are either setting up co-creation processes right now, or are going to commence new co-creation processes next year, right? And one of the big lessons we've learned so far is how important that early stage of planning for co-creation is. Very often, it's difficult to go back and correct measures that should have been taken at the start of the process, and it's very disappointing after a lot of effort has gone into these processes, and you've convened a lot of consultations, including at the subnational levels, to be later found by the IRM to not meet certain standards or to not meet certain basic requirements. So we would encourage all of you to spend a little bit of time at the early stages of co-creation, or if you've even begun to work within your MSFs or the active stakeholders, to develop at the beginning a very clear timeline with clear stages of the process identified. Also think a little bit about the methods that suit for each stage, how you will report back and provide feedback to stakeholders at different stages, which of course is an OGP requirement, as Alan and Tintin have shared, and capture all of that through the OGP website or repository, which again is a requirement. So coming to the developing a co-creation timeline and roadmap, this is something that we've seen is an area where countries in this region can improve upon. There's a tendency to think of a co-creation timeline as a series of consultation events, and then sort of just briefly describe a final stage of drafting commitments and getting action plans approved. But what we've learned, I think, over the last 10 years is that this tends to be the whole co-creation cycle from when you start the process to when you actually get a action plan approved needs to be an iterative process. So there's certain recommendations we have from what we've observed over the years. One is right at the start of the process. It might be good within the MSF or even within line ministries, many of them from Afghanistan, for example, represented today, to think at first about the gains and some of the gaps that have that exist on open government issues to date in your country or in your portfolio context. Assess how reforms in previous action plans, many of you are not doing the action plan for the first time. So it's important to assess how reforms in previous action plans can be continued or enhanced. Very often we see in this region that there have been some great ideas that have been introduced in the second or third action plan, but somehow they just drop off. And it's never quite clear whether that is intentional because those reforms have been completed, or whether that has just been an oversight. So a robust discussion within the MSF on what has been gained from previous action plans, what needs to be continued. Consideration of previous IRM recommendations is all good to do at the beginning so that there are certain parameters within which you can frame the rest of the process. Here, it's also good practice to think about what a good open government vision or strategy, long-term strategy that you're working towards is, so that the action plan eventually can build up to a coherent strategy rather than just being a smattering of sort of commitments that don't necessarily build up to a broader idea, a broader vision of how government will be opened up across all its functions over time. I think at the same time, this is a good moment to think about how you're going to involve the public most effectively to identify new needs, priority issues, themes that might have come up in previous consultation cycles or not. So this goes to having an engagement strategy, as Sohail was telling us about earlier, having that clear at the start of the process. We've seen very often, and this is not just true in this region, but in several others, where you see, as I was saying earlier, in the same event, sort of an awareness raising session, asking citizens about their problems, but then also trying to workshop commitments all at once. And that's something that we would ask countries to consider doing differently. The second piece is to think about which moments in your co-creation process you're going to ask for expert input, right? So when it gets down to the details of you've collected ideas of problems that need to be addressed, themes that need to be addressed, even some potential solutions coming from citizens or different beneficiary groups themselves. But then there is a need to think about what has government already done on these fronts, what needs to be done, what is the technical feasibility, the legal feasibility of some of those. Based on that, who needs to be engaged for the remainder of the process? So think within your co-creation process, what are the stages at which you will gather expert input, whether that's from civil society, from state institutions, or others, sort of other organizations like academia or think tanks or specialized actors. Then there's a stage of drafting commitments with feasible milestones. And often again, in co-creation timelines, we see this as a single phase, perhaps over a couple of months, but really not enough consideration to the fact that there needs to be a very concerted effort to look at all the inputs and feedback that has been gathered and ensure that the commitments clearly articulate the problem, state the status quo, so identifying all the information that helps you determine the baseline from which you're going to be operating off, the milestones and the expected results. This is also a stage where we find that it's useful to think about what is the broader coalition or constituency group you will need to have eventual buy-in into the commitment or its implementation. So for example, very often you see at this stage ideas that might require legal change, but you're not really having a thread of conversation with sort of parliamentary processes to think about how that might come about. Or you see commitments that will clearly involve interagency coordination, but the commitment is being drafted completely in silo without engaging those eventual sort of commitment holders or supplementary holders of commitments. So we suggest that within your co-creation process and timeline that you allocate enough time to the stage of drafting ambitious commitments with feasible milestones that takes into account that this will be an iterative process which might require several back and forths between different stakeholder groups. And then finally, around securing approvals, ensuring that you build in the processes to get the necessary approvals from the implementers, decision makers, the intermediate decision makers, sort of alluding again back to Ken's comments earlier. What are the interim buy-in processes you need to be able to make sure that the commitments that are being drafted will see eventual buy-in from the final decision makers that need to sign off, but also from the implementers who will have a role to make sure that there is a credible implementation plan in place. Once all of that is agreed within the MSF, it's important to remember to publish this co-creation roadmap and timeline to meet that process transparency requirements, of course, which the IRM looks at. And throughout all of these stages, this is something that our thinking has shifted on. In the beginning, we would say, conduct awareness raising at the beginning of your co-creation process. That is undoubtedly important. But I think one major learning has been over the years that it's important to plan for communications and awareness raising moments and activities throughout the cycle, especially as you start to bring in new stakeholders into these dialogues. Throughout these stages as well, I think important for the MSF to consider how you will filter and prioritize inputs and commitments. So if you're going to be holding consultations that invite thousands and thousands of ideas, good to think about how you will filter that before you even get into thinking about how those feed into draft commitment proposals. And eventually, when you have ideas for multiple commitments, to think about how you're going to narrow that down to the recommended 15 or 20 commitments that OGP asks that action plans include. And across all of this, of course, this is not a linear bureaucratic, how inclusive you want to be at each stage, remind yourselves of that, and leave room to course correct, because even the best laid plans, when they meet reality, might need a shift in approach as you go through the process. So that's something that we would encourage all countries to do, to think about these stages, the processes, the methodologies across all of them before you commence. Just a reminder, moving to the next slide, to be intentional about the design. So to think at each stage of consultation about who the target audience is, what is the background information they need to be able to participate, what resources they might have. So if you're asking people to participate in online meetings, to think about, how technology divides might work differently for, people with disabilities, the elderly, communities that think about what are some activities that you can do synchronously, so all at the same time, through in-person meetings or online, or what are the processes that you can have in place that collect input over time, both offline and online, and sort of feed into other processes for that filtering and prioritization. Our colleagues from Afghanistan, from the Ministry of Women Affairs, rightly pointed out the need to be mindful of gender and inclusion issues. This, as some of you might know, has increasingly become a focus for the partnership. So we encourage you to think proactively about what inclusion means in your context, which are the vulnerable groups, and how they will be factored into the process, as well as into the eventual commitments. There are a range of resources around this that OGP has been developing with the input of countries that have made progress on some of these issues. As follow-up to this workshop, we'll be happy to share that with all participants. And then finally, sort of to reiterate that, we've seen as reasoned response, many countries provide a end of process sort of reflection on what was heard and what wasn't. But particularly for many of the countries we have in this region that engage hundreds of people in the co-creation process, one suggestion is to consider how you might give feedback upfront about how the input is being collected, what decision-making process will be held with that input, and at the end of that process, of course, go back on how the input is influencing the outcomes of the next stages of the eventual decisions. So reporting back to all participants you hear from on how their input is considered is really important if you want to sustain engagement. And this isn't just about meeting IRM or OGP requirements, but also to keep that community that you build with these extensive consultations alive. And then finally, of course, just a reminder then to make sure all of that is available online. It's linked to evidence. You document as you go along so that when the IRM assessment or the self-assessment comes knocking, you don't have to do a lot of extra work then, but you have actually captured all of those inputs and outputs as you've gone along, so that the reporting doesn't become a burden that often we hear tends to become quite onerous when it all comes at once towards the end. So those are just some of the lessons we've learned that go beyond sort of ticking the box or being compliant, but really point to the need to have intentional design informing each stage of your co-creation process. And with that, I'll hand over to Ivy to just talk about a little bit of the current context within which many countries will be co-creating this year and next, and some ideas around that. Ivy?
Thanks, Shreya. So, as we all know, it's a bit, at least even for the countries who have started co-creation last year, it's quite a different experience altogether to be doing this with the limitations of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So working online, you see sorry, can you do the previous slide first? There you go. So there are, two realities for working online, right? You have your challenges, which Shreya already mentioned earlier. You have challenges around access for even Wi-Fi or electricity, and then you have the additional challenge of using Zoom, being familiar with the platforms that is an experience even for folks who might not be as digitally savvy or digital natives. So there are barriers already to even taking part and engaging. And then you have the next barrier of, if you're trying to establish relationships with new folks, then you have to build trust through, online platforms. And again, when you start building trust, the additional challenge of how do I make sure that I don't lose their interest in the next few months or the next few years. But then we've also heard from our stakeholders that there are opportunities. I don't have to expect to get folks to travel every single time just to have a conversation. There have been some news about, getting more folks to join because then they don't have to bother with plane fares, etc. So there are, pros and cons to working online. But one thing that we are trying to focus on, at least for now, is to make sure that whatever opportunities that we see, especially on peer learning, which is what we're having right now across countries, it allows us to reap the rewards in a way. So in the next slide, you will see something that the support unit developed last year, and we still continue to update. This is taking the OGP co-creation process online. And let me also just share the link to the resource on this one. There is something in English and in Russian. Let me just do that very quickly in the chat box. So I wanted to just show this one because we all know that there's no blueprint available for getting online engagement right. What works in one context or setting may not in another. So our experience so far is that it's good to smartly combine the two, if feasible in your context, in person and online. Still, at both times, grounded in principles of good engagement. We see that this still delivers the best results. So if you actually go into this link, I would advise you to first click that first bullet on questions to consider. The major questions which Shreya already, some questions actually Shreya already mentioned earlier, I think would be helpful as you're trying to think through co-creation. Because it's helpful if you think about what you're expecting from online engagement. And at what stage of the co-creation process are you seeking to engage? Because as most of you know, after your first action plan process, there is, the first stage of identifying priorities, problems, and solutions. And then you eventually get to developing and drafting commitments. And then you'd have to prioritize ideas and commitments. So that first chunk, you'll have to think through on what kinds of platforms are available, but depending on what kinds of contributions am I expecting stakeholders to provide. And the last question being, who should you engage? Because as I mentioned in the stages of co-creation process, the purpose of each process is different. And for whatever reason that you're going to use online engagement for that stage of co-creation process, you will have to think through what your objectives are and the types of people that you will be involving. Because the types of people you involve that will mean that you will have to alter the way you even either get them to participate or get them to provide input. And then you can mix, Zoom and maybe an offline document. So it all depends on what works best depending on who you're engaging. So happy to provide more input on this as you look through it. There is also at the bottom part of the section online tools and platforms, and you'll see that there are certain tools and platforms that are better for a specific type of engagement. Some countries, you will see in the country example, some countries have done it in different ways. So feel free to also look through that. And if you have any questions, again, you can just reach out to your support unit contact. And the next slide, as you all know that we have already launched the Open Response and Open Recovery campaign last year, emphasizing the importance of the fundamental values of open government, transparency, participation, inclusion, accountability, that these values are important as we try to rebuild health systems, return to school, vaccinate everyone, etc. So I wanted to just show you that there are resources that you can access on open response, open recovery, and open renewal, because we know that there's a real opportunity now to ensure that the plans are responsive to citizens and their needs, because there is no escaping how the pandemic has impacted nearly every aspect of governance across different contexts. This year, OGP members will co-create a record of 100 plus action plans. So we actually see this also as an opportunity to demonstrate how open government is essential in how we respond, recover, and eventually renew our societies. So in this link, you will also see specific thematic areas that maybe you are already seeing as, a priority issue or a priority concern in your respective contexts. Feel free again to look at the examples of how you can, tie in whatever it is that you think are urgent concerns that you need open government values to be embedded in. And now I will, after all the things that we've just shared, I think it's easier to also hear from a resource person. So we're happy that the OGP point of contact from the Philippines and the non-government secretariat of the Philippines, so we have a government and civil society person to share their experience on two items, right? So one, we want to hear actually from Claire Bautista, the point of contact from the Philippines, first, on what kinds of innovations did you have to do on co-creation, as well as any lessons that you've learned from doing this prior to the pandemic and even during the pandemic. Claire?
Hello, good morning. Good morning. Thank you for inviting us to share the country experience for the co-creation process that we did we are actually in our 5th National Action Plan implementation, and we saw the greater demand to deliver more transformative impact and felt results through the country's open government commitments. So actually for this 5th OGP cycle, we scaled up our efforts around by going around the country and holding the widest and most extensive open government consultations. The PHOGP MSF, or what we call the steering committee, is structured such that we have equal membership from government led by the Department of Budget and Management as the chairperson, and the non-government led by the Mindanao Coalition of Development NGO networks led us as the co-chairperson. And then each sector is supported by their respective secretariats housed in DBM for government and the identified non-government organization chosen by the non-government steering committee. Currently, the non-gov secretariat is lodged under the Code NGO or Caucus of Development NGO networks. So, with respect to lessons learned, we were able to come up with 10 commitments for the 5th National Action Plan. which covers 11 programs or initiatives divided among 11 agency or government commitment holders and 6 non-government commitment holders. So what we did is the DBM, through which is the government secretariat, and Code NGO as the non-government secretariat, made a desk review of the IRM findings and current plan status, results of previous dialogues and consultations. We did initial brainstorming and technical discussions. Then regional consultations were conducted with non-government sectors. And then these were done to identify priority commitments that would be proposed to government for inclusion in the current action plan. The result of these consultations is the Open Government Partnership Citizens Agenda, which was submitted to government agencies. Then the Citizens Agenda, which contains the commitments proposed for adoption, went through discussion within the MSF or the steering committee before it finally got into the action plan. So we actually had the public launch of the action plan in December 2019. And then here comes the pandemic. So with the resolution issued by the Criteria and Standards Subcommittee, we jointly crafted with non-government steering committee members, the government steering committee members came up with guidelines on how we would be able to revise our commitments in the action plan in order to include COVID-19 response, and also to revise the timelines, given that we are allowed for a 1-year extension of the implementation. So perhaps the lessons learned there is, despite the difficulty or the challenges of doing this online, we were actually able to have 2 PHOGP orientations, 15 bilateral meetings, 52 agency-led stakeholder consultations. This was in the co-creation process of the revised 5th National Action Plan. And then the inclusion of milestones pertaining to COVID-19 response. Also, we are in the process of finalizing the monitoring tool that we will be using for the implementation of the commitments, which we did also through a co-creation process. So the monitoring tool has undergone series of consultations with commitment holders and various stakeholders, such that we would be able to get the actual performance of the commitment holders with respect to the action plan. As mentioned earlier, the bottom-up approach that we did, as opposed to the previous NAP consultations, was really helpful in that we were able to come up with what we feel is our commitments that better address OGP values and result to transformative impact. I'm sure our partners in Code NGO also have a lot to say about what we did in the co-creation process. So that will be all from me for now. Thank you very much again, Ivy. Back to you.
Thanks, Claire. Mav, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Ivy, and also thank you, Claire, for sharing our experiences in the co-creation process and allow our experiences and the progress of the non-government participation in the OGP that we have gone through in the Philippines can be perfectly described as an evolution. Why it is an evolution? Because it's continuous changing and improving for the better. It evolved from the creation of our first National Action Plan to our current or 5th National Action Processes. From the government-centered or top-down approach, which have a limited consultation, to a bottom-up approach with an active participation of the non-government sectors, resulted to a sense of ownership. I think the inception of the CSOs or the non-government secretariat in 2016 paved the way to a more participatory crafting of the 5th National Action Plan, which shared by Claire, which will ensure the participation of the non-government sectors in the OGP processes. We can say that we have considered that the 5th or the current National Action Plan is the real trailblazer for us. Why? Because for the first time, the non-government sector crafted an OGP agenda that served as our basis for the government consideration to the commitment for the 5th National Action Plan. We also led the nationwide consultations. We have the 16 regional or sub-national dialogues together with the government counterpart, which is Department of Budget and Management, resulted that majority of the commitments of the 5th National Action Plan are currently being implemented with the non-government partners. We are proud to say that the 3 commitments of the 5th National Action Plan are CSO initiated. And there's also a lot of demand since the 4th National Action Plan, and we're successfully included in the 5th National Action Plan, particularly the commitment for the indigenous people. So the commitment of the indigenous people pushed through in the 5th National Action Plan. This co-creation process also realized because of the active engagement of the non-government steering committee in the whole process. They have been very proactive and very vocal in pushing for the non-government agenda within the whole steering committee and provide us a clear guidance on how we expand the reach of the open government partnership from the non-government sectors, from the people's organization, academe, business sectors, and even the public sector unions. Of course, our good working relationship between the non-government and our government counterpart allowed us for a smoother coordination, transparent processes, and even clearer delegation of tasks, even when we shifted online to revise our plan due to the pandemic. We also maximize the OGP as a platform for convergence among various stakeholders, such as government and the development partners, to sustain engagement of the non-government sector in the processes. We are really fortunate to have support from the development partners. For instance, when we conducted the co-creation workshop, in the past, development partners such as USAID, UNDP, and even World Bank provided support to CSO so they can participate in the process. Our also government partners also hosted OGP meetings and consultation where the CSO can actively involve in the process. And even when we shifted to online consultation, we made sure that the process is co-created under the new normal, so maximizing the technology and reaching the non-government sectors, even in the farm-plong areas. And also, we can say that through the active involvement of our key champions from the government and the development partners, this is a clear manifestation that the CSOs are not alone in the open government advocacy. We are together in our collective call. Let's co-create and advocate to open up the government processes, because we know we can restore the Philippines people's faith in the public institution when governments proactively respond to the demand of the citizens and also the private sector to increase transparency, integrity, accountability, and stakeholder participation. We are also aware that a lot of spaces for civic participation are slowly closing in. But we know that the space provided by the OGP for constructive engagement continues to be accessible, and we should claim it. We should continue to strengthen the CSO voice in the processes. I will end my sharing by some of always reminding us, even in the non-government, that the OGP is not the answer to all the society's problem. And it will not end the poverty or save us from this pandemic. But as we see it, the OGP as a platform with a co-creation process that can be tapped to change the culture of governance. So how can we do it? This can be done by bringing the right people in a common and safe space to discuss public problems and how we work together in addressing these public problems. That's all. Thank you, or maraming salamat.
Thank you so much, Claire and Maf. Very, very rich conversation. Even discussions on what you've done, and even the lessons that you've just shared. Right, the importance of broader participation that you encouraged, even in the face of Zoom land, for for your revision of the action plan, the importance of MSF members from civil society championing and creating space for stakeholder priorities of civil society on public issues, finding key government champions, and the government secretariat allowing for space to look for, to nudge them to actually, use the platform and work together with civil society and citizens and private sector to have it in the action plan. And again, you get going into other partners, other stakeholders in the Philippine society, development partners, private sector, and getting them to participate. So very rich lessons from the Philippines there. So I sent something in the chat. I'm going to open it up. I know we have just a few minutes left. Maybe two people who would probably want to share, anyone who wants to share any good practice that you have in your country around co-creation. Alternatively, you can also share, a major lesson that you've learned on what you should not do during co-creation. My request is to keep it brief. So let's open it up for anyone. Or if you have questions.
Hello?
Deputy Minister Nazira, yes?
Yeah, I have one suggestion. There prepared a roadmap of OGP from countries share with all stakeholders for sharing their experience. And also, thanks for all explanation. I hope we have useful and useful document at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy. Yes, we will also share a recording of this and some of the resources that you can use as you go about co-creation planning with the help of the OGP Afghanistan Secretariat as well. Is there anyone else?
Thanks, appreciate that.
You're very welcome. I think if there's no one else, Alan, maybe you can.
Sure. Yes. I mean, we will send you a list of the resources that we've referred to during the presentation, and I know there are quite a few. So stand by for that email. Amongst those that we've mentioned include the National Handbook, the Participation Co-Creation Standards, the Toolkit, the RM guidance on the minimum threshold for reaching involve, the procedural review policy, taking your OGP process online, and illustrative commitments guide to COVID-19. Other support that the support unit are able to offer are also quite extensive, and I know many of you have used this in the past. We're able to provide feedback on the co-creation roadmap and methodology and plans, feedback on draft commitments, advice on outreach and awareness raising, where you've advanced a bit further in the co-creation process and you've decided on themes or are looking at draft commitments, we're able to broker peer exchanges and connections with thematic partners and experts. And we can also conduct enhanced co-creation support. And that is sort of workshops with the multi-stakeholder forum or political stakeholders or bureaucrats to sort of dislodge bits of the system that might have become a little bit stuck. So the next slide is a sort of a process map from one of the workshops that we've run before. We have folks who are not some of which are in this team and some of which are in other teams or contracted to us, who are great at facilitation and process design, and we can deploy that where you think you've come across a more resistant problem and would like some external assistance in facilitating a way through. We've done that before in Macedonia and the Philippines, and we're going to look forward to doing more of that as we go forward. So please do get in touch if there is an issue that is been on your plate that you're wanting some assistance with. That's all from us today. Thank you again for joining us. To recap, we talked about the importance of investing in a good co-creation process, some of the relevant standards and guidance from the OGP on how the processes should be run. We looked at how the IRM assesses co-creation, how to set up the co-creation process, including during a pandemic. We heard from Philippines, who shared lessons from their co-creation process, and then we ran through a list of resources and other support the support unit can offer. Thanks again for joining us. I'm mindful of time, and we look forward to working with you. And please do stand by for a follow-up email from us. But thanks again, and we'll chat to you soon.
Recording stopped.
Все, наконец-то.